So, hello, everybody. I'm Peter Larson with the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. We're about to start if you're here for a webinar to talk with Dr. Tarek Loubani about the ongoing situation in the crisis in the Middle East, the ongoing situation in Lebanon, and about what Canadian government is doing or not doing, and what we should be recommending. You're at the right spot. I'm happy to be here in Ottawa, and I'm happy to say I have the permission of Kittikinzigi Reserve here in Ottawa to be continuing to do our work, and we're happy to get their land, their acknowledgement of our presence, and we acknowledge that this is their land and unceded. This evening, the way things will unfold is Waleed Ibrahim and I will be asking questions of Tarek Loubani. We'll go back and forth for a little while, and then we will turn it over to the audience for questions with a Q&A. Grafton Ross, who was the vice chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, Grafton will be in the background monitoring the questions and trying to pitch them to us. So without greater ado, I thought I would just start off by trying to share just a map of Gaza. Most of the people here are quite familiar with what we're talking about, but there's a map of Israel-Palestine here in orange and tan color, I guess. This is the orange is what the government of Canada recognizes as Israel, and this is the West Bank here, the kind of beigey color, the reddish kind of color, and there is Gaza down in the bottom left-hand corner. Gaza is a very small area. It's about 40 kilometers from north to south. In fact, it's 15% of the total area of the city of Ottawa. Most people here know that most of the people living in Gaza are refugees. And Gaza had a number of very important refugee camps. We've often heard about the bombing of Jabalia, for example, Khan Yunis, Rafah, and so on. So we're talking about 2 million people squeezed into a very small area. Why don't I just start off with asking Waleed to introduce himself and his organization, just very briefly, so we know what we're dealing with.
Sounds good. Thanks, Peter. You hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Waleed. I'm the president of the Association of Palestinian Arab Canadians here in Ottawa. APAC, which is maybe not the best acronym considering our cousins south of the border, but we are a long-standing Palestinian community association in Ottawa. We've been around since 1985. We are a social, cultural, and educational organization. So a lot of our activities are focused on keeping the Palestinian identity alive, as well as educating the broader community about issues related to Palestine. And of course, no Palestinian organization would be, even a community association would be doing its job if it ignored the fact that so much of our identity is tied to what's happening in Palestine, even though we are part of the diaspora. And so the reality of occupation, apartheid, and colonization are central to who we are as Canadians living in the diaspora. And so the ongoing genocide has really pushed us into stepping up our activism and advocacy efforts. And so we are one among a number of organizations that work together to organize weekly protests in the National Capital Region. So back over to you, Peter.
Well, not quite, because you've got to say a word about yourself.
Sure. Okay. So I'm a Canadian of Palestinian origin. There's not much that's all that interesting about me personally, but I am the son of a Palestinian refugee who was born in Jaffa, Palestine in 1937. So 11 years before the creation of the State of Israel. He was forced to flee in 1947. at the age of 11 with much of his family. They all ended up in Gaza. And so the entirety of my father's family, almost all of them are still in Gaza. My mother is, many folks will know that 80% of Gaza's population are actually refugees from other parts of Palestine. My mother's family is among that small percentage of families that are originally from Gaza themselves. So both sides of my family, much of my extended cousins and extended family are still in Gaza and have been directly impacted by the ongoing genocide. And we could spend a lot of time talking about just that.
Thanks, Waleed. Now, Tarek, I'm hoping that some people on this call don't know who you are or don't know much about who you are. Many will, of course, but would you just introduce yourself a little bit?
I am a Palestinian living in Canada, and I am also an emergency doctor. I've been working in Canada for the last, I guess, now at this point, almost 20 years, and also have been traveling to Gaza regularly to work there. I'm not from Gaza. I'm from the north of Palestine, a small town called Sasa, which is close to Safad, which people might be hearing about nowadays. But my family was displaced from there to the refugee camps of Lebanon, where they have remained. Um, in terms of my experiences, they really revolve around participating in the healthcare system in Gaza. So I've really participated there, trying to build infrastructure, trying to build self-reliance and independence. So those have been kind of the headlines of all the work that I'm doing. If you try to figure out, what am I doing? Ask yourself, what are the ways in which we can gain independence? So for example, solar power project that we did actually now 10 years ago this year, that put solar panels on 4 of the hospitals in Gaza. And that's to gain energy independence so that we didn't always depend on the Israeli kindness for electricity, as it were. And then also 3D printing, in which we were making medical devices there, initially things like the stethoscope, and then eventually things like tourniquets, where they were used in the Great March of Return. And I, of course, have also served. You can't be in Gaza for any length of time without serving during a war. So I served both during the 2012 war, 2014 war, and then also during the Great March of Return while that was ongoing.
And as I remember, you were actually shot during the Great March of Return. That made headlines in Canada for some time.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah. In May 2018, on the day that I was shot, there were 1,700 people shot. People know my name just because I was the Canadian.
Right.
But 1,700 people were shot that day. While, just because this may tie into some things we say later, while marching peacefully, hands up, saying we want our rights, and basically being a good little nonviolent direct action type people.
Well, that does tie into where I'd like to start off is have you remind us. Well, actually, Waleed, that's a question you you go
yeah
for.
No problem. So thanks so much, Peter. Honestly, like, very excited to have you here for this discussion, and very grateful that you're participating in it. I think this is a great opportunity for folks to get a much richer understanding of what's happening on the ground, from somebody who's seen this stuff firsthand. So we know that you've served in Gaza several times over the years, before October 7. So you have an idea of what life was like in Gaza before the genocide began. We understand that, or many of us understand that the situation since then has become just unimaginably horrific. But it also wasn't an ideal situation before the 7th of October. We're talking about a territory that's been occupied by Israel for 57 years, and it's been under a complete land, air, and sea blockade for the past 17. In that 17 years, a number of wars. You've referenced how you've served there in the context of a couple of them. So can you set the stage for us about what Gaza was like before October 7 and some of the experiences that you had while you were there?
The history of Gaza, ever since the occupations began, I mean, I guess British occupation, but then the Israeli occupation in 1948, has really been one of progressive tightening, progressive expulsion, exclusion, and deprivation. So before October 7th, there was a policy in which Palestinians were deprived of almost all of the routine parts of life. For example, on the best day, you might get 8 hours of electricity. Like, imagine on the best day. And in the dead of winter and dead of summer, you'd be lucky to get 4 hours. More often, it was 2 hours of electricity per day. And this, of course, in a context where Palestinians had the money to buy the fuel to run the generators, but weren't allowed. And when Palestinians finally started shifting to solar power, the Israelis banned solar panels, banned batteries, banned inverters. Inverters are the piece that connects the solar panels to a house system. And so the Israelis really progressively banned almost all of the ingredients that make anything resembling a life. So if you want to take like an example and try to project it, there is this man, Dov Weisglass, who was one of the advisors, high up advisors of the Israeli government. And he said that he wanted to put Gaza on a diet, called it the Gaza diet. They worked out the number of calories that would basically deprive Palestinians living in Gaza just enough that they're suffering, but not enough that they're dying. So that's kind of the zone they were in, because they mistakenly thought that if they killed Palestinians en masse, that the world would care about them. So that was the Gaza diet. Now, that's what was happening um, publicly in terms of food. The same thing was happening with electricity, with clothes, with any kind of cement or building supplies. All of these things were under control. And as Palestinians, of course, Palestinians didn't just sit still, they were adapting to the new conditions. And as Palestinians adapted to the new conditions, the Israelis started progressively more and more and more bans. Some examples. The Israelis at one point banned cumin, coriander, chocolate, tea. You know, they were sort of banning all of these things, and the Palestinians responded. And of course, they banned all fertilizers. So the Palestinians responded by creating the biggest, until for quite some time, the biggest organic farm in the world. They took one problem that the Israelis didn't let them have sewage treatment, and they pointed it at another problem that they didn't have fertilizer. So they would use human sewage, dry it out, and then put it on the fields as fertilizer. And of course, you know, there are the silver linings, like an organic mango grown in Gaza tastes amazing. An organic fig grown in Gaza tastes amazing. But as the Israelis sort of figured out that these adaptations were happening, they'd always fight them. And I remember one of the last ones before October 7th was that, of course, they had totally banned concrete. And so Palestinians started building more and more using wood. And so they banned any wood that didn't flex. They'd take a piece of wood, if it flexed, they'd allow it in. If it didn't flex, they wouldn't. And so Palestinians got wood that flexed and glued it, you know, what's called lamination. They glued it in layers until it wouldn't flex so that they could build with it. And then the Israelis went targeting glue. So it was always this, I guess, cat and mouse of dignity. The
Yeah.
Palestinians sought it, made it happen, and the
So
Israelis tried to take it.
when you use the term banned, like how was Israel? Because we often hear the argument that, well, Israel left Gaza, it's no longer occupied. We know that the ICJ has a very different opinion of that perspective. But when you talk about banned in the context of an occupation, what does that look like effectively on the ground?
Israel
How does
has
Israel?
Israel has full 100% control of entry and exit into Gaza. It did before October 7th, it did after October 7th. You know, they're like little puppets in Egypt, basically put on a facade of not having complete Israeli control. But even when doctors and healthcare workers were traveling into Gaza through Egypt through this very highly specialized program that allowed not nearly enough to go in, not often enough, even then, all the names had to be vetted by Israel. So they are the ones who chose how many trucks went in and how. They controlled the sea so that even fishing was banned. And in terms of even allowing people in, like for example, for me, they also progressively cranked up the ability. So in 2014, I tried to go in through Israel for the first time because I was banned from Egypt. Unfortunately, that ban remains. That was because I was in jail in Egypt for some time. So when that happened, I tried to go in through Israel. Of course, they banned me. And so we sued them. And in 2014, it was possible through the court system to make it into Gaza. As time went on, it became harder and harder to do that because the courts got more and more packed. And you could get a bad judge, they would just deport you from the airport. I spent an awful lot of time. I think I've spent more time in Ben Gurion Airport naked than clothed. So, and I've spent lots and lots of time in Ben Gurion Airport. And that sort of uh, way of behaving was such that even when you were allowed to go, there were always complications. For example, we have a medical team waiting to go into Gaza right now. They were supposed to go in on the 17th. We got a call less than a week ago, that said their date has been changed to the 8th. That's yesterday. So they all had to scramble, change tickets, which costs money, drop shifts, pay coworkers to take work, etc. And then they rushed over. They get there. The Israelis say, no, we haven't approved you yet. You can't come in. And so then we're like, well, now we have to get hotels for all of these people, right? Plus, that's time they should be spending caring for Palestinian patients. And so now they've given them another date in the end of October. So what's happening to them was happening even before October 7th. It's always been about deprivation. It's always been about humiliation, and it's always been about elimination.
I have obviously so many follow-up questions to this. I think the first thing that I want to reflect on is just you casually kind of glossed over the idea that you've spent more time naked in Ben Gurion Airport than clothed. And I think that that's something that shouldn't be glossed over. I'm not saying that you shouldn't gloss over it, but I think for the folks that are listening in on this, just the idea that somebody who's coming to deliver life-saving aid to others is subjugated to that type of treatment, I think is incredibly indicative. And you are somebody who is a medical professional who is coming to Israel, Palestine with a Canadian passport, so that all of the protection that implies. And so if that's how you're treated, we hear about the torture and rape that happens in Israeli prisons to Palestinian political prisoners. I just want to kind of emphasize that if that's happening to somebody like you, we can only imagine the depth of the depravity that happens to Palestinians that are living there in Gaza and don't have the supposed protections that we have access to. So that's not so much a follow-up question, but just something that I want to reiterate.
Yeah, and Waleed, we don't even need to imagine. Like, for example, Hamad Abu Salmiya, the head of Shifa Hospital, he hasn't spoken about this publicly. However, other witnesses have reported that when he was in captivity, he was stripped naked. I mean, the Israelis are obsessed with Palestinian genitals. They always have been. They always have been. And they stripped him naked and they made him basically crawl on all fours, eating and drinking, licking off the floor, et cetera, while he was on a leash. That kind of humiliation is happening. These prisoners who are in prisons like say I don't even know how to pronounce the name, Teit Seman, are so like brutalized that even the Israeli police felt they had to do something about it and go arrest some people. And it was unthinkable that there would be any accountability. Because the lack of accountability, there's all of this. But we hear the stories. We see the end results. Like, we don't actually need to imagine this. We see it.
So what I to you and I think the answer to this is very obvious, but maybe to some of our participants tonight, it might not be. In what is the end game for Israel? Why are they doing all of this? Why play the cat and mouse game? Why the ban? Why the shaming and embarrassing and torture? What's the end game?
I used to think that it was about colonialism. And I thought, okay, they just want as much of our land as possible with as few of us as possible. But that doesn't account for it. Like, if that were the case, why are soldiers wearing women's underwear in Palestinian homes? Like, that doesn't account for it. Also, the Israelis are about to lose their entire colonial project over this. And so the real question that I've been asking myself, the thing that really I felt intellectually constipated trying to figure out is, well, then what are they doing? Why are they doing this? And the only answer that makes sense to me is that their sense of racial supremacy is so important to them that actually all of their actions only make sense when you place them in the context of racial supremacy. So why do they want to control us? They want to control us because they think they're better than us, and they want to prove that to us and to themselves. And that's why, in a sense, October 7th was possible because they didn't think, Palestinians had the mental capacity or the strategic capability to execute such an attack, despite the fact that obviously it's been reported in multiple places there were warnings. And people who even more or less figured out what was going to happen went to their elders, and the elders said, or the superiors, and the superiors said, Palestinians aren't able to do that. So I think racial superiority is the explanation here. They don't want to genocide us, they want to subjugate us. And yes, a big part of that is ethnic cleansing, because it's easier to subjugate smaller groups of people. But fundamentally, the ethnic cleansing and the genocide is in service of them restoring their sense of racial superiority. And the thing about racial superiority, we see this with the Americans and with white people in general a lot. The one thing they hate is either being told or feeling like there's something they can't do to the browns or to the blacks. And that functionally is what right now the resistance, both the armed resistance and the unarmed resistance, is doing. It's basically saying, you will not dominate us, you will not control us. And that probably accounts for some of the frankly hysterical behavior of the Israeli activists in Canada and the United States and of the government and military in Israel.
I was
Got it.
listening today to a podcast, Empire, on the British repression of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya in the 50s and 60s. And if you took out the names of the Mau Mau and the British and inserted Palestinians and Israelis, it was the brutality was unbelievable, and it was very clear in that case as well. It was the British sense of superiority, and there was a lot of the same kind of bizarre fixation on castration and torturing people. That was really quite sick and quite reminiscent of what we see going on today. Over here is going on today in Gaza and maybe now in Lebanon as well.
Yeah, and I want to say, like when I was in Iraq, I saw some of this behavior. So, for example, there was one patient who I saw, an elderly woman in her 70s, when I was in Baghdad in one of the hospitals called Medinat al-Tib. And the Americans were looking for her son and weren't able to find him. So they took her and basically started torturing her, hoping that she would tell them. And she came to our hospital after they were done with her because they had perforated her rectum with a broomstick, which is actually what triggered this attempt to arrest the Israeli soldiers. So we know that, anal rape and rape in general and these sorts of like sexual violations, they happen in general in these places. But that story was pretty extraordinary. Other people had heard of things like that, but it wasn't very common. When we saw it en masse from Abu Ghraib, we were very, very disconcerted. At this point, the Israelis have made Abu Ghraib seem like a day camp. They really have innovated in depravity, and the fixation on our rectums, our anuses, our penises, our vaginas, it's disgusting and it's very uh, weird. Like it's just so odd that this would be something that they would be so fixated on.
I want to ask you a bit, Tarek, about the Canadian government's role in this, what it's done or not done. But let's just start off with a specific thing. When you are badly treated at Ben Gurion Airport as a Canadian national, what kind of help, if any, or interest do you get from the Canadian government?
I'll tell you the last time I really thought that the Canadian government would save me. When I was arrested for the very first time in Israel, I had the living shit beaten out of me. And when
What were you
I think,
arrested for? What circumstances?
oh, oh, sweet. I was arrested for absolutely nothing. They arrested me outside of Jenin in a little town called Araboni. I was doing human rights
Jenin is
observation.
a Palestinian town in the West Bank, the northern part of the West Bank. Yeah. Okay.
Correct, yeah. And a center of resistance that had been wiped out just before we had arrived there a year before. I was there 2 years, 2 summers running, and it was the second summer I was arrested. So, I had the shit beaten out of me, and then the somebody from I forget who exactly it was. I don't believe it was actually the ambassador, but somebody from his staff came to see me and documented all of my injuries. And he had a notebook, and he went away. And then, a week or two later, I got beaten again. Um, the the way that it worked in that particular jail is I was in jail with a bunch of white people, like Swedish people, Norwegian people, etc. And so when they were perceived to misbehave, I took the beating because they considered me the Palestinian. They would occasionally say "Efu Kennedy" when they wanted to grab me. Where's the Canadian? But they would usually say "Efu Falastini." And so they would beat me. And so the second time I saw this guy, I'm like telling him about my injuries. I'm like, well, where's your notebook? Why aren't you writing? And he told me that he was given instructions not to write any more notes because somebody had leaked the notes of my previous beating. And that was in 2003. So the Canadian government
20
has
years ago.
not, yeah, the Canadian government has become more pro-Israeli and has joined the project. I have spoken at this point to every level up to and including the prime minister, ministers, members of parliament, the prime minister. And consistently in the past, they used to pretend they cared and never do anything. And now they don't even bother. They are pro-Israel. And if they do say any statements at all, they are obviously lies.
Okay. Um, why? What do you think?
Well,
What's your theory on why? Is that American pressure? Is it because they're all real Zionists? They hate Islamophobia. How do you explain this to yourself?
it again, the only because if it were a colonial project, if it were an investment for Canada, right now it's a really bad investment. You better cut and run because oil prices are going to go up, which, the Canadian economy depends a lot on in different competing ways, I guess, when you count in the oil sands. But lots of the economy is going to collapse. You can't explain it through profit. You can't explain it through continued hegemony because they are about to lose. The Canadians, the Americans, the Western world has lost all of their international institutions. The ICJ, the United Nations, all of these institutions are going to collapse now. The ICC has not been able to issue.
Close the door. Hold on a second.
No problem.
I think keep going. Yeah, I think you can keep going.
The ICC has not been able to issue an arrest warrant in how many months now? It's just all of the international institutions are losing legitimacy that countries like Canada, Germany, so on depend on. These are countries that pretend to care about international laws. So truly, the only thing that makes sense here is that Canada is a deeply racist and white supremacist state. And when you say that, I'm ashamed by how much of a revelation that was to me. Because for it to be a revelation to me, it means that I have been, for decades since I arrived in Canada, I've been in Canada for 33 years now. For those 33 years, I've been ignoring my Black brothers and sisters, my Indigenous brothers and sisters, my BIPOC brothers and sisters who have been, and siblings, who have been all saying since the beginning, Canada is a genocidaire. Canada wants to kill everybody who's not white and wants to dominate them. Well, Canada has genocided. I went to grade 5 and 6. I did social studies, probably like you guys did. I didn't hear anything about that. And it was too much for me to handle when I heard it. And it took me literally decades to fully integrate these lessons that my siblings in the movement have been trying to tell me for years.
So Tarek,
But
how do you square that with the Canadian immigration policy, the huge numbers of South Asians, Pakistanis, Indians, Chinese, Asians, and Arabs that are coming in? How do you square that genocidal intent with bringing or allowing, encouraging all those people to come here?
see, when the British Empire, I think we can look at the OG empire, the British Empire. When they were around, they used a lot of brown people, right? There's an inferiority complex in my culture as a Palestinian. And I used to leverage that impulse. For example, when I would go with a stethoscope in Gaza and people didn't want to accept this 3D printed stethoscope, I used to say to them, well, we use it in Canada. What was I doing? I was taking advantage of the fact that they think Canada is better than them. And therefore, if it's acceptable to white people in Canada, it's acceptable to brown people in Palestine. And it took me quite some time to realize that I was reinforcing and deepening that inferiority complex, not doing something clever. And the Americans and the British have used immigration and migrants as a tool. Like, I mean, imperialism fundamentally is the theft of the brightest minds and the best talent from all of these places where they should be into the heart of the empire, where they're told, okay, you can have your Diwali, all right, you can go pray Eid, but and this is the mistake we made, right? Because I've been praying Eid. If I asked for it off on at work, I got it. And I thought that I was integrated into this society. And I thought I was building capital in this society by being a good little citizen. I was a good little doctor. I was a good citizen. I was donating to the parties. I've donated to the Liberal Party for the last 10 years. I donated to the NDP party for the last 10 years. And I've worked phones. I've knocked on doors for both of those parties. And so when Palestine happened, I thought, okay, you know that I've been good. You know that I've been a good little boy. Like, could you pretty please consider us as being non-animals? And they're just like, fuck you. No. And so the reason why they allow the immigrants in is because they need us. They need me. I'm keeping their emergency running. I work
Mhm,
straight night shifts and probably work, 1.5 times as much as most of the other doctors around.
mhm,
They need why is Northern Ontario, the province that I live in, why is that full of Indians? It's not because Canada suddenly discovered how beautiful, diverse, and ethnically rich India is. It's because they want cheap labor. That's what they want. And once that cheap labor starts to threaten them in any way, then they set it aside, cast it aside, or eventually will tell us, we told you the reason why you didn't have control was because you didn't donate enough or because you didn't vote enough or whatever. But now that you've done all those things, like, actually, no, we're still not going to allow you control or power. I think that's what happened
mhm.
to Palestinians, and I think that's what's happening in Canada as time goes on.
Waleed?
Yeah, thought um, you've said a lot there that's uh, a fairly bleak assessment, unfortunately. But I think you've tapped into something that I can say that as a Palestinian Canadian, um, I at least like can relate to in terms of um, I have felt always being an immigrant to Canada that that I am Canadian. I don't really talk about it in this context because I don't like to bring in my professional experience because there are risks related to anti-Palestinian racism based on what I do professionally to be involved in the work that I'm doing as a volunteer outside of work. But I am a public servant, so my views tonight are not representative of my role as a public servant. But I will say that since October 7 in particular, and I know that this is a sentiment that many Palestinians in Canada have felt. We have felt incredibly betrayed by our institutions, by the political system, by our elected officials, by our so-called leaders, that we don't even have the humanity, that they don't see us with even just that the minimum level of humanity to intervene and stop what's happening. There are so many, not just Palestinians, but there are so many human rights organizations, the United Nations, these respected institutions and multilateral fora that sell us on the idea of human rights and international humanitarian law that have been ringing the alarm since day one that this is a genocide and that we are watching a genocide be live streamed, and our officials have barely batted an eye. There has been next to no empathy, sympathy, and so that has left us feeling incredibly dehumanized and incredibly frustrated. And that is not a good place to be leaving, an important, like a segment of your so-called, like of a so-called diverse society. So there is absolutely, and I'm not trying, like I'm not diminishing or dismissing any of what you're saying, but I know that many in the Palestinian community here just feel incredibly frustrated and let down or betrayed by our political institutions. Not that they were necessarily being incredibly representative of our perspective to begin with, but that the bar has been set so low in terms of just the grievousness of what's happening right now that people wouldn't stand up and say, absolutely, there needs to be a ceasefire immediately. That should not have been there should not have been a need to try to make that case for 4 months until the prime minister finally started adding Canada's voice to the international calls for a ceasefire. The fact that we're a year into this and Canada has still not imposed a two-way arms embargo in the context of a genocide where there is so much evidence that's being put in front of elected officials about this is frankly shameful. And so maybe I'll end with a question, or all of this I'll lead to a question around kind of where does this leave us? What should we be doing, right? So we've been out on the streets across every Canadian city for a year now, at minimum once a week, if not more, asking for demanding a ceasefire, a permanent and immediate ceasefire, demanding that Canada impose a two-way arms embargo, and demanding that we finally contribute to an end of this 17-year-long blockade of Gaza. Are these the right demands? What else can and should we be doing as ordinary Canadians to try to bring about change in this situation?
Yeah, I can see why those demands and those methodologies are the ones being used, right? It makes sense. That's what we've always been told. We've always been told that, and I guess maybe before we start, since we're all doing disclaimers, I represent me, I don't represent OFIP. So, we've always been told that, again, like, if you're a good little boy and you just turn the other cheek long enough and take your licking from the oppressor, eventually the oppressor will tire of it, or will grow a conscience, or somebody else will intervene with international law or whatever. And so all of these techniques, thinking about a two-way arms embargo or whatever, these are not sufficient, because any solution here that ends in Israel being able to carry out another genocide in 5, 10, 20, 30 years is going to result in exactly that thing happening in 5, 10, 20 years. Israel is constitutionally incapable of not expanding. It's an expansionist regime. It is constitutionally incapable of not being a pariah. It is constitutionally incapable of not being apartheid. It is an apartheid state. It is by its very, like, you don't even have to ask Tarek Loubani. We have these discussions like, oh my God, if I say that it's an ethno-nationalist state, is someone going to accuse me of anti-Semitism? The Israeli leadership says it's an ethno-nationalist state. They're proud of it. They don't recognize anything else but an ethno-nationalist state. An ethno-nationalist state does not have the right to exist, should not exist, and will always cause problems so long as it exists. Period. And so, what is our role now? Okay, we've marched. I'm not saying stop marching. I, in fact, think that marches are very, very good and very effective. The way I think of it is if the marches were ineffective, the police wouldn't show up to beat us down each time. I was in Edmonton for a march this Saturday where I spoke as well. And it was very clear that all the police were there. They all showed up. God help anybody who needed a cat out of a tree or something else that the police might actually be able to do right, because they were all there at this protest, making sure to be as big jerks as possible to us. So these protests work. That's why they're being policed so heavily. Nonviolent direct action works. Why do you think they're trying to destroy the lives of Palestine Action? I'm going to explain what Palestine Action is because probably most people here don't know it. Palestine Action is a direct intervention group. They call themselves not protesters, they call themselves actionists because they want to change things by their hand. They're based in the UK, but there are also some of them who are based in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, they've succeeded by putting consistent pressure and increasing the cost of business in getting Israeli weapons manufacturers kicked out of the places where they're working. In the UK, they've gotten landlords to cancel leases. They're working now on getting an insurance company to cancel insurance. They've literally destroyed manufacturing tools so that weapons cannot be made. That's highly effective, but they are being hit really hard, obviously. They're being threatened with huge, huge jail terms, 8 years, 10 years, 20 years. And in the UK, just as a quirk of their system, that's not happening. But I'm not sure that in Canada or the US, you'd be able to accomplish that without going to jail for a very, very long time. They would spend more time trying to find somebody who stops a bomb from being made than they would trying to solve murders. I'm sure of it. So I think we have to think creatively and expand. But I think also to get to sort of what I think is the most important change we have to make, mentally speaking, as a pro-human rights movement, we have to shift to understanding and supporting armed resistance. Because armed resistance is currently the thing that's stopping the genocide from completing. Armed resistance is the thing that's stopping the Israelis from wiping Lebanon. Armed resistance is the only thing that is holding back the Israelis from bombing Iran, from destroying Yemen. It's costing them. And we have spent far too long, and I put myself at the front of this list, we have spent far too long afraid of what happens if we support armed resistance or explain it or endorse it or whatever. And the fact is that nobody who's going to accuse you of being a terrorist thinks that they shouldn't have the right to kill you. They all think they have the right to kill us. But they think that while they have the absolute right to annihilate Palestinians, Lebanese, Iranians, Syrians, Yemenis, everybody else, that nobody should ever pick up arms against them. And that's an equation we have to start changing. So even within our own discourse, we have to start talking about what armed resistance means. What does it mean? And also how we can migrate the discourse so that we accept armed resistance as part of these anti-colonial and anti-racist movements. So, for example, Palestine is under the microscope. It will end. The struggle will end and we'll win. We're going to win this. But after that, there are going to be other struggles, some of which we don't necessarily pay attention to or understand. Those struggles will still be governed by the same framework that we set during the liberation of Palestine. And so if we don't understand and then figure out how to talk about armed resistance, then those struggles, which are not going to be under the microscope, will suffer while they're trying to sort of throw off the shackles of their oppression.
Mhm. Thanks, Lotta. In terms of armed resistance, there is, definitely, I think, a live debate or kind of discourse among pro-Palestinian organizers. Like, to what extent is that brought into the conversation? I think you would be hard pressed to find a Palestinian or any kind of common sense person that looks at a situation where there is oppression, occupation, set aside Israel, Palestine, set aside what, like this specific issue. I think in any context where you have a people who are occupied, even under international law, there is clear endorsement of an occupied people's right to resist against their occupiers. So long, that there are certain limitations on how that's exercised, but even in an international law framework, that right to resist is enshrined. And so I think a lot of pro-Palestinian organizers, the debate is not so much about whether that right exists or not. It's more about to what extent do we emphasize that right. So in a Canadian context, many of us feel that in order to bring about the pressure that's needed for Israel to change course, the cost has to become so high that it essentially is forced to change course. And so many of us look at, for instance, the South African BDS model as the approach that should be adopted, and where you have a group of people that are so disproportionately disproportionately less powerful in relation to those who occupy them, and so using like appealing to the hearts and minds of people, educating folks about just the depth of the injustice, that would bring about a shift at a grassroots level, from people in a Western context to oppose essentially what Israel has been doing to Palestinians all of these years, and to force a shift in like a transformational shift that would result in the dismantling of this Zionist idea that within historic Palestine, that there has to be a Jewish majority. And I think many of us are very comfortable with the idea that that's simply not going to work. Like, you can't take an existing indigenous population, force them off their lands, and the only justification that you offer to them for them to be forced off their land is that, well, you're not born into the right religion, so you don't belong in this place that you were born in and that your parents are from. So I just, I think the idea is that a lot of folks think that the resistance language is not necessarily what's going to appeal to the hearts and minds of a lot of our counterparts in Canadian and Western society. And Western governments are really the only ones in the world that are supporting and standing behind the Israeli Zionist colonial project. And so in order to break that bond, you have to appeal to the hearts and minds of folks. So how would you respond to
I want to, excuse me, Waleed, I'm raising my hand here. It's 20 after, and we have to let other people get in and ask questions. Sort of Tarek.
Okay, I'll make it quick. Fuck the hearts and minds of the people who've been sitting on the sidelines while every single international human rights law has been violated over the last year. Fuck them. So I think that's sort of the way that I approach it. I'm not doing this anymore so that I can make our liberation comfortable for white people. Just not. And you mentioned ANC as a model. or the South African movement as a model. So everybody knows Nelson Mandela, and the common telling is that Nelson Mandela was one of the founders of the ANC, African National Congress. This is true. But do you know about Mkhonto Wesizwe? That is, I think, Xhosa for Spear the Nation. And essentially, that is also a group that was founded by Nelson Mandela, and I may get some of the details wrong, after one of the massacres. I think it was a Smallville massacre, in which he basically said the only way we're going to do this is through armed resistance. Till the day he died, he endorsed the Palestinian armed resistance. Nelson Mandela did. This man who we look at as a man of peace, but that's because we are sold these stories of peaceful nonviolent resistance. And so I'm open to the idea of doing peaceful nonviolent resistance. And so are the Palestinians. 1936, general strike. What happened? You know, any time that the Palestinians have done anything peaceful, they've just been massacred. You know, they tried to approach 1948 relatively peacefully. Didn't work. Intifada number one, if you want to fast track a little bit, Intifada number one was little kids throwing rocks at tanks. What did the great statesman, I think it was, who is it?
Rabin.
Rabin. What did he do? He said, break their bones if you catch them. That's why we call it the revolution of sticks and stones and broken bones. The Second Intifada, 1 million bullets were fired on unarmed Palestinian civilians in the first week of the Second Intifada in 2001, or 2000, sorry. So you're talking now about this continuous record of Palestinians trying their best to be nonviolent. The Great March of Return had tens of thousands of people marching with their hands up. You have to understand, Gaza's full of AK-47s. Nobody brought them. Nobody fired on the Israelis. We all marched. I saw it with my own eyes week after week. They marched, they chanted, they sang. They were met with so many bullets that 22,000 people were injured, 6,000 of them with live fire. 200 and something died, including at least 3 or 4 medical personnel. I mean, including me, I was shot. The day I was shot, 1,700 people were shot while they were standing around doing nothing but just being there. So I think the Palestinians have given, the hearts and minds that you talk about quite the opportunity to open up to our humanity. And it didn't work because it doesn't work. I challenge you to name me even one anti-colonial struggle that wasn't not just had armed struggle, but was foundationally an armed resistance movement. The more I look, the more I can't find anything like that. And that's why I finally wrapped my mind around the idea that, okay, fine, like I'm not going to pick up a gun. I'm a doctor. I'm not going to pick up a gun. I'm going to go and I'm going to boycott. I'm going to sanction, which, by the way, are obviously effective tactics too. But at the same time, I'm not saying that we have to be the armed resistance. All I'm saying is we have to stop talking about them like they're our ugly stepchild or something like that. They're not. They're the leaders of the protection of our liberation. And so we have to start thinking about them like that and changing our perspective from being so focused and attentive to the needs of the people who are oppressing us, to being focused and attentive on the needs of the people who are being liberated, who are liberating themselves.
I see that a number of people have, thank you, Tarek. I see a number of people have put questions in the Q&A. Grafton Ross is back there curating them. If you have questions, I'm afraid I can't deal with people. Some people have raised their hands. I'd rather you put your question, write your question in the Q&A if you wouldn't mind. Grafton, have you got a question for either Tarek or Waleed?
Yes, I do. A question for Tarek. And I should mention that I won't necessarily take the questions in the order that they were sent, but more to try and achieve some kind of a flow. How do you see within your own medical network or within society in general, do you see that Canadians are becoming more aware of what's happening in Israel, Palestine, And do you have any sense that popular opinion is turning?
That's a tough one because I'm in a sense isolated. I've tried to, as much as possible, talk to normal people who I don't usually interact with or who aren't part of my personal social bubble. And my sense is that everybody, there are two pieces. Everybody has a feeling that what's happening to Palestinians is wrong and needs to be corrected. But at the same time, the propaganda impact is so strong that people are afraid to believe their own eyes. They're afraid to believe their own heart. And so everything that they see, I get the feeling that they're like, but I don't get it. They fall for that particular propaganda, but I probably shouldn't get involved. They see that people have been suspended and so on. I see this especially in my professional settings where a lot of people will come to me sort of and whisper in my ear how much they support Palestinians but are afraid to say anything. So my sense is that people emotionally are very much with the Palestinian people. A lot of that is to do with social media really getting to the picture out to them in a direct way. But I'm not sure how much that changes, how much that creates movement, positive movement in the Canadian political scene. I do think it is going to make it harder for Canadian politicians to do bad things. Like, for sure, we've seen the NDP become less shitty because of the normal Canadians' reaction to what's happening. Um, but then again, we haven't really seen the Liberals become less shitty. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, I think, on that. My sense is probably they're coming along, but it just doesn't feel like it's enough right now.
Eric, when you say that people come and talk to you privately, um, are they white people? And the fact that they're not willing to speak up, is that a reflection in your mind of white supremacy? I'm not exactly sure whether you're talking about white supremacy at the sort of the government level, or are you talking about societal level?
It's hard. I think so. No, not just white people. A lot of brown people come to me and talk to me too. And, these people are almost by definition more recently immigrated to Canada, one generation, two generations, three generations, maybe. And so they feel less settled. They felt
You feel
that
less what?
settled. They feel less settled in terms of their
Settled. Yeah,
place.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, for example, a doctor who might be the first doctor in their family in two generations. And so I think they see there's a lot to lose. And of course, the Zionists are hysterical. Like, they're shooting off on basically everybody who says anything that they don't like. And what I've found is that the Zionists don't generally target people like me who are able to fight back. Very similar to what they're doing in Gaza. They're not going after the resistance, they're going after civilians. They're targeting people who might have said something, who don't really have much of a background, and making examples out of them. And so that's kind of been my observation. Now, fundamentally, all of it is rooted in white supremacy, right? Because if you think as a person of color that you don't have a voice in Canadian society, well, that's because of white supremacy. The white people who sympathize but feel they can't say anything, I mean, obviously there's a relationship to white supremacy, but I don't think they're saying it because they feel that truly Palestinians are inferior. I think they just have been fed so much propaganda that you can't, like, what is Israeli propaganda? Don't trust yourself. That's Israeli propaganda. You saw it with your own eyes. It's not true. Palestinians are acting. Oh, you think that killing, 200,000 of them is too much? Well, don't trust your instinct. It's not enough. And all of it really happens at the level of destabilizing a person's innards so that you're like, well, I don't like seeing kids die, but I mean, I don't know that I know enough to say something about that. And that's what I think I'm observing more than a direct impact of white supremacy.
Grafton?
Yes, you're probably aware, Tarek, that the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada wrote to Prime Minister Trudeau calling on the Canadian government to suspend diplomatic and economic relations with Israel until it complied with the ICJ advisory opinion. The question is, do you think it's possible to get support from Canadians to actually convince the Canadian government to suspend diplomatic relations with Israel? Or do you even think that's the appropriate course of action?
This is
I
so
mean, the
far.
appropriate course of action for people, is it even worth taking that initiative to call on the government of Canada to suspend relations?
I mean, this is so far outside my scope of experience and knowledge. So what I'm saying is what I believe, but I don't really know. Like, I'm not a political theorist or scientist. I'm a doctor. And at least to me, it sounds like that is a very noble effort that needs to happen. All of these things need to happen. I'm glad that South Africa went to the ICJ. I'm glad that I forget his name, referred often as Sleeping Beauty, the chief prosecutor of the ICC. I'm glad that he requested the warrant. I'm glad that all of those things are happening. These things are, in a sense, important for posterity. But I don't think they change anything fundamentally. Canada's going to abandon Israel when Israel fails. That's when Canada's going to do it. They are so in lockstep. I mean, the Liberal Party is going to lose this election because of their support of Israel. That's clear. You look at some of their biggest donors for years. Mohammed Faqih, I'll say his name because he's very public about it. That guy, like, I had conversations with him in which he told me how amazing the Liberals were, you know, literally a year ago. And I think realistically, we have to look at the journey of people like that and imagine that that bodes very, very badly for the Liberals. The Liberals are in a death pact with Israel. They're going to die with Israel. And I think that extends not just to the Liberals, but rather to the whole Canadian governmental infrastructure. Because fundamentally, when Israel collapses, the reason why so many people are focused on Palestine is because it is not a singular place of conflict. It is a place that's going to unlock a whole bunch of other oppressed places. So, for example, when Israel collapses, that's going to unlock places like Egypt, places like Saudi Arabia. It's going to unlock probably places like Morocco. And simultaneously, because of their work and effort with some of the other dictatorial regimes all around the African continent, and other places, it's going to unlock a lot of those places too. Similarly, we have built a broad movement. The Palestinians are supported in a lot of ways by a lot of countries, not least of which is South Africa on the diplomatic front, but Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iran on the axis of resistance front. Those countries won't suddenly demobilize. They're going to look, and similarly, the same way that the expansionist tendency exists among the Israelis, the liberationist tendency isn't going to go away. Che Guevara didn't just chill after they got Cuba. You know, he kept going, and Cuba was, of course, essential in unlocking a few other liberation struggles around the world. And I strongly suspect that's going to happen with Israel Palestine. So
Tarek,
in short, I think that's why they're working so hard. They're in a death pact.
Tarek, I think seems to me you contradicted yourself. Um, I think it seems quite probable that the Liberals will lose the next election, but I find it unlikely that its position on Israel or Palestine is going to be a key factor. I think you were saying earlier, where I think the contradiction is, you were saying earlier, most Canadians aren't really engaged enough on this. So I don't think very many Canadians would vote on this, and in any event, they're not going to vote for Poilievre. Explain your thinking on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree with you. But these elections, especially in first past the post, they hinge on very small numbers. If you, for example, have 2,000 people not show up in London, you probably turn London, Ontario, where I live, you probably turn that riding around, you know. And so you have the people who will go out and actively vote against. You have the people who will just not show up. And then you have people like me who used to be active contributors to these political parties. I used to take all my friends to go voting. I used to talk to them about the NDP. You know, I was seriously considered on October 6th, I had a meeting with the NDP in which they invited me to run, and I said yes. You know? And on October 7th, I watched the bullshit start to pour out of the NDP, and I was like, what the hell is this? And of course, there was after my what I wrote about them, there was no question that I was going to run for this party. So I think you're right that people aren't going to vote on the Palestine issue, but I do think that you underestimate that because we have been better citizens than just voters. Like the people who care about Palestine, we've been building capital for years and we're pulling all that capital. We're no longer volunteering. I'm not out there knocking on doors. I'm not talking to people. If I am talking to people, and I'm an elder at this point in my communities, I'm telling them don't vote liberal. I'm telling them don't vote NDP. You know, so I do think that there are ways that this is going to impact them. For sure, the Palestine vote and people thinking about Palestine changed things in the UK. I think that's a good model to look at because in the UK there were, I think it was 6 independents, people who decided we can't run within the parties. We're going to run as independents. They ran as independents, and as a result, they were able um, to basically run on the Palestine issue unimpeded by their party. And I believe 5 out of the 6 of them won their ridings. So you have this large movement of independent people who are now there. So this is kind of my rationale. I don't dispute that it is possible to contradict myself. I mean, sure. This is an active discussion. I don't come here as an expert in politics. I come here as a speculator and observer.
Grafton, somebody else.
Okay. This is more a suggestion for you and Waleed. Can APAC and OFIP set up a speakers bureau where we can go to have experts speak to us and our friends about the history?
Well,
Peter, do you want me to respond to that? Or
sure.
actually, there is already a speakers bureau that is organized through OFIP. I am one of the speakers that is part of that repository. So that exists. If folks want to submit requests to Peter for speakers, then they're welcome to do so after this call, and I'd be happy to participate.
And maybe we can even draw Tarek in at some point as well. I will send out a link to that list of people on our speakers bureau when I do the follow up to those people who registered for this. That's good. That sounds like a very self-serving question, but thank you. Appreciate it. That's good. Is there another one?
I'll follow up to Tarek on voting. If not Liberal, Conservative, or NDP, who should people vote for?
I don't care. Like it's not that I've got some great ideas here for you. I just think that when people have so supported the genocide, they should not be rewarded for that. So forget the idea of lesser of evils, all of that. Do you really think like here's how I kind of heard it explained, and I'm amenable to this particular explanation. If we make the liberals suffer, if we collapse the liberals, we Brian Mulroney them, what was it, 1992, 1991, when they lost all but 2 seats, that is going to precipitate, obviously, the resignation of Trudeau, but that's going to precipitate an awful lot of self-reflection. And the only way to trigger self-reflection is loss. Because if they win after what they've done, they will never self-reflect. We know that Poilievre is bad, but Poilievre is not going to do more for Israel than what Trudeau is doing. Trudeau is doing the maximum possible for Israel. And I think we all have to quit, being in denial about that. What else could he possibly do to support Israel? I mean, I guess he could go put troop boots on the ground, but I don't think that the Canadian people would support that. So practically speaking, he's doing everything he possibly can. So I think there are 2 things here. One is we have to imagine new political formations. For example, in the UK, they gave us a good example. Run independent people. Run independents, support them, make sure they get elected, make sure that the parties that supported genocide suffer. Now, if Sarah Jama, the MPP from Hamilton, if she happened to be a NDP candidate, I would support her. But just like any boycott, you can selectively exclude people who've been excellent on the topic. For example, we're boycotting Israel. However, the academic, social, and cultural boycotts of Israel specifically exclude people who are anti-apartheid, who are anti-racist, who have actually advocated for human rights for Palestinians. So if your candidate in your riding hasn't specifically said something supportive of Palestinians, like, and I don't mean bullshit, I mean like really signed a letter at some point, done something that was meaningful, then that person should go. And if you need to run people in your riding, support them. Vote for somebody else other than them. We have to create a political cost because there will be no accountability otherwise. We have so little ability to have political accountability. Like there will be none. I mean, if the Liberals win again, we are lost.
Mhm.
We are totally lost. Luckily, that won't happen, but
Mhm. So for those, a follow-up question to that, for those that are, trying to organize for the next federal election, which we know will happen in a year, if not sooner, what would be kind of the worst thing that the worst advice that we could give to those that are trying to organize around this issue, in terms of, like what would be the worst outcome? Supporting like not punishing the liberals, trying to avoid a conservative majority.
Waleed, we're losing your sound.
Did you get the question about it?
yeah, I heard the
Yeah.
question. Yeah, your sound's just stuttering a bit, but it's okay. Basically, I think that the worst possible outcome here is a Liberal victory. That is absolutely the worst. That would mean that they presided over a genocide and won. There's no worse outcome than that. I think that the least worst of the parties is probably the NDP. Certainly not the Green Party. The Green Party did everything that they could to exterminate any kind of pro-Palestinian instinct multiple times. And I'm sure Dimitri Lascaris, who ran for the leadership, I'm sure he would very happily discuss that with your audience at any point. So I think that realistically, we just have to make sure we sink the Liberals. Whatever happens after that, I think is fine. But I also personally think that we also have to punish the NDP. The NDP have been good liberals. They've been great liberals. Their position right now and throughout this is what I would have expected to see from the Liberal Party. And so if we let the NDP skate through with their minimalist sort of appeals to international human rights with no real action base, then I think what will happen is that that'll push them more into the center left position. We do not need another center left party. What we need is a genuine progressive voice. And if the NDP has not been that, which they haven't been, then we should not reward them for that.
Tarek, let me pick away a little bit at your claim that Pierre Poilievre wouldn't be worse than Trudeau. I've already thought about this because his language is more pro-Zionist. Trudeau is a bit more qualified in language. But if he were, I haven't really thought of this perspective before. If he were prime minister, what could Canada do to support Israel more than we are already doing? I mean, it seems, in fact, it seems to me that we kind of support Israel more by kind of pretending that we're not. Anyway, reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Poilievre decided he was going to send planes into the fight, which is possible. If he decided he was going to send, that's most likely, right? Because planes are relatively inexpensive. But remember, Trudeau sent boats, right? So it's not like the Canadians didn't send military hardware. And the Canadian government is still allowing for tons of weaponry to make it in, even though they claim that they don't. So I just don't think that Poilievre is going to be meaningfully worse in any real way. And I understand, I don't want to live in a country with a conservative government. However, that is my discomfort. That is a pain that I will bear if it means that we're able to actually change things in the internationalist perspective. And if we punish the liberals in a proper way, like, remember, they're not the least worst right now. They have committed murder, as it were. The fact that the conservatives may have committed murder does not mean that they have committed murder. Like, if you think about it in an individual rhetorical perspective, the liberals did it. You can say, well, the conservatives would have done it too, but they didn't do it. They didn't do it. And that's not how we work. We don't, hit people for the things they may have done. We hit people for the things they did do. And I think, the real interesting question isn't should we punish the liberals or not. The real interesting question is what to do with the NDP. Because the NDP are genuinely less shitty. They're not good. The NDP are not good, but they're less shitty. And so why wouldn't we stand behind them and try to prop them up? And I think the real answer there is that they have, and I say this, though I struggle with this, I think the real answer there is that they have really not taken a progressive stance. And so, yes, if we end up with a conservative party, we're gonna be out in the wilderness for a few years.
But some
if
NDP members have.
Yeah,
right?
they have. Yeah, of course. Mainly the ones who are not running again or who have left the party, right? Like, what's that guy's name? The guy who used to be a rock star. I forget his name right at this exact moment. He's been great on Palestine. Matthew Green has been great on Palestine. Like, even Lindsay Matheson from London has been great on Palestine. Like, these are people who I'd happily exclude from my boycott, as it were. But I think as a general party, like Jagmeet is shit on Palestine. He's basically where a liberal would. Yes, Charlie Angus, thank you to that commenter. Jagmeet has just been bad on Palestine. Like, in the first week, really what he was doing was basically totally ignoring the context in which October 7th happened, totally taking in the Israeli propaganda points. I mean, all of which have been disproved, and he hasn't really walked any of that back.
You want to comment on Heather McPherson since it's raised in the chat?
Yeah, McPherson, fine. She's good. But McPherson, I spoke with her personally sometime back in January. And what I told her then is that your tweets are amazing. Your official statements suck. Because in her tweets, I really felt a deep connection to a person with humanity and a person who did some really serious thinking about what a progressive position on Palestine looks like. But that doesn't, she's the foreign affairs critic. That doesn't translate into the NDP's official positions. That doesn't translate into statements with her name signed at the bottom. When you read those official statements, they just don't do that. So let's say that Heather McPherson is amazing on Palestine. Fine. That is one person in a whole country. We've named 5, right? Like Matt Green, let's say Lindsay Matheson, from Manitoba, Nikki Ashton. Like there are a few of them who are good and genuinely progressive, but they're all subject to whip. They're all subject to the whip, and that is one of the fundamental problems that we have with parliamentary politics. Anyway, I'm truly like I'm talking way outside my capabilities here. I'm truly not a political analyst. I don't really know the right answer to this one. I just have this strong feeling. With the liberals, I think I'm pretty clear in my mind on what should happen. With the NDP, I'm less clear. I'm pretty sure. I think this is what we need to do. I think actually what we need to do is start developing independent candidates and independent parties that are able to mount real challenges so that they can actually go and say real things. Because Ashton, who's super progressive, probably can't say what she wants to say because she's whipped. Same with McPherson, same with everybody else. And the people advising Jagmeet are, at the end of the day, the same people who are advising Mulcair, same people who sort of pushed the NDP to the right, thinking that if they just had a brown Justin Trudeau, everything would be fine.
Eric? Loubani. We're getting near the end here. I'm afraid I'm going to have to pull the plug shortly. It's 10 to 9. I know that you're flying out of the country tomorrow, so we're really glad that you were able to fit us into your tight schedule. Waleed, do you have something, a final comment you want to make?
I don't have a final comment. Can you hear me okay?
You can.
I do want to ask, though, you did make reference to the fact that Thada is flying tomorrow to Lebanon. Maybe Thada, you could just take a couple of more minutes to talk about what you're planning on doing there, based on what's currently happening in Lebanon, and how Israel's aggression and genocide essentially has now extended to encapsulate Lebanon.
Yeah, this is really deeply unfortunate what's happening in Lebanon. I think a lot of us looked the other way for way too long, and I put myself again at the top of that list of having made that mistake. I had been thinking about the readiness of Palestine for so long to be in this war that I never thought, well, what about Lebanon? Is Lebanon ready for a war? Because truly, if I had thought through it, I would have understood that Lebanon was a natural consequence. Whether the Israelis won or lost in Palestine, they were always going to attack Lebanon. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing, a natural extension of their deeply expansionist genocidal policy. So I want to go there because the medical system has fully collapsed. Right now, for a number of reasons that I won't get into on account of time, the medical system is non-functional. And that means that we have to take the same energy and enthusiasm that we took to try to help Palestinians and apply it to Lebanon. The Lebanese are, I'm not saying this because I have some kind of feeling that there's an ethnic connection between Lebanese and Palestinians. Anyone who knows me knows I don't care about nation states at all. But we are one people fundamentally facing one conflict with one goal. And if we can disable the Israeli state so that it is not able to conduct genocide, then that is going to seriously impair its ability to conduct genocide everywhere. They're not going to be able to attack Iran. They're not going to be able to attack Yemen. They're not going to be able to attack Palestine. It's one struggle. And I can't go to Gaza. I'm one of the people who has been banned from day one from going to Gaza in this conflict. I've tried 5 times. I've been to jail 4 times. While trying to get in, and I've been deported from everywhere that I've tried to go to get into Gaza. So it's incumbent on anybody who has the ability to help Lebanon to help Lebanon. And I'm not saying that because helping Lebanon helps Palestine. No, I don't think that way, and I don't think anybody should think that way. I'm saying that because Lebanon is a place that has a people that is of importance. And that place is deserving of our attention, just like anywhere else.
Tarek, your dedication and your courage never fail to impress, and your interesting ideas, some radical ideas, will certainly make people think carefully. Thank you so much, Tarek. I want to. As you know, I said I would be glad to. The OFIP will make a contribution. Hopefully, that will help pay for your trip to Lebanon in some small way. And I will say to those who are listening in that OFIP puts on these events at no cost to you, but as a cost to us. And I will be asking in my follow-up email if you want to give a donation to OFIP to help us cover our basic expenses. That would be very much appreciated. All the people who register for this will get a copy of this video, and it is shareable with other people, so you can share it with your friends and provoke conversation. Waleed, thank you very much for joining us and not only asking questions but contributing your thoughts. Grafton, thank you very much in the background. We didn't get to cover as many questions as I had anticipated, but our answers from both our Waleed and from Tarek were fulsome, and I thought it was a rich conversation. So with that, on behalf of the Ottawa Forum on Israel Palestine, Tarek, thank you. Waleed, thank you. Shukran Katir, and bon voyage as well. Have a good evening.